Om Mahyanati Vandasya Chansula Shlaka Sakshan Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah Namo Vishnupada Krishna Pastaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swami Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharine Nirvishesha Sunyavade Paskachai Desatarine. Hare Krishna. So we can start recording.
Recording in progress.
So today we will discuss Canto 4, Chapter 29, verses 60 till 75. We will first read the first verse. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya Narada Uvacha Yanavara Bhate Karma Tenaivam Mutra Tatpumam Bhunte Yafyavadanena Lingjena Manasa Svayam. The great sage Narada continued, the living entity acts in a gross body in this life. This body is forced to act by the subtle body, composed of mind, intelligence and ego. After the gross body is lost, the subtle body is still there to enjoy or suffer. There is no change. Now, Narada Muni, after speaking to King Prachinabarishad, and after explaining him the perils that await the Puranjan, which is every embodied soul, which should also know that this body, which we are so attached to, composed of air, water, fire, that earth, water, fire, air and ether, which we think is us, is doomed to be crushed into dust with the passage of time. And how much suffering we are ourselves lining up for by identification, by the identification with this body. So after hearing this about the gross body, King Prachinabarishad asked the question, since this body dies and we have to accept another body, what is it that is carried from one body to the next? Because the thing that carried out the activities has turned into dust. So what is carried from one body to the next? That is his question. So Narada Muni, he begins to describe the transmigration of the soul. So in this chapter we will hear scientifically all these details of how the transmigration of the soul works. In the 15th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna explained this already in text 7 to 11. He explains the signs of transmigration in a very concise way in Bhagavad Gita. So we will read that, and then we will hear Narada Muni's explanation. So this is the key to spiritual life. Srila Prabhupada will reveal that. But here is the explanation in brief from Bhagavad Gita, chapter 15, verses 8 till 11. Sariram yatavapnoti yatshap ukramati shvarahrit vaitani samyanti vayurgandam ivasayat. The living entity in the material world carries its different conceptions of life from one body to another, as the air carries aromas. Thus it takes one kind of body and again quits it to take another. So the subtle body is carried from one gross body to another. Shotyam Shaksus Parshnam Sarasnam Granam Ivasha Adistayam Anashayam Vishayam Upashivate. The living entity, thus taking another gross body, obtains a certain type of ear, eye, tongue, nose, and sense of touch, which are grouped about the mind. It thus enjoys a particular set of sense objects. So what is the conclusion, therefore, for spiritualists, especially for devotees? So association will fill your mind with one thing or another. Krishna continues. Ukramantam stitam vapi bunjanam va gunam vitam vimudanam pashanti jnana sakshusa. The foolish cannot understand how a living entity can quit his body, nor can they understand what sort of body he enjoys under the spell of the modes of nature. But one whose eyes are trained in knowledge can understand all of this. Yatanta yoshan shenam pashant atmanavashtitam yatanto pi akritatmano nainam pashant ashechata. The endeavored transcendentalist who are situated in self-realization can see all this clearly. But those whose mind are not developed and who are not situated in self-realization cannot see what is taking place, though they may try. That the foolish cannot understand it. That the endeavoring transcendentalists, they can understand, and they are very careful. So in these 4 verses, a concise explanation is given of what Narada Muni is going to explain here. The same science of the transmigration is explained by Vasudeva to Kamsa. When Kamsa grabs Devaki by the hair, he starts to explain about the transmigration of the soul. It is a horrendous thing. If you kill your own sister on the day of her wedding, what a horrible, disgraceful thing to do. What will be your future and what happens to you in this life is inevitably because it is determined by what we did in our previous life. What is there to be so disturbed about? I'm reaping the fruit of one's own karma. But now we hear what Narada Muni is saying, answering King Prachinabarishad's question. So can someone read the translation of text 60 again, which is on the screen?
The great sage Narada continued, the living entity acts in a gross body in this life. This body is forced to act by the subtle body, composed of mind, intelligence, and ego. After the gross body is lost, the subtle body is still there to enjoy or suffer. Thus, there is no change.
Yeah, because the body is gross, it cannot perceive anything to do with reality. That's important. With these gross senses, we cannot perceive reality. Even though one may try, as Krishna explains, we cannot. The living entity is fine, spiritual, and is meant to act with Krishna in the spiritual world. He is in a gross body in this life and is in another gross body in the next life. This body is forced to act by the subtle body. The subtle body is Sukshma Sarira. Sukshma Sarira. Within the gross body composed of earth, water, fire, air and ether, there is a subtle body composed of mind, intelligence and false ego. The subtle body fills the gross body. We can see this because with a little effort I can move my mind down to my fingertips. And with a little effort I can move my consciousness down to my toes or to the top of my head. So the subtle body is filling the gross body. So the soul is filling the subtle body with consciousness, and that subtle body is filling the gross body. We see the gross body, the subtle body and the soul in harmony, then we see it as me. But it is not me. The gross body is being forced to act by the subtle body. And after the gross body is lost, the subtle body is still there to enjoy or to suffer. So there is no change of identity. The gross body turns into dust. But all our desires are carried by the subtle body, and according to the nature of those desires, which can be gross, subtle or deeply spiritual, one will attain a corresponding body and continue to exist. So here in text 61 is an example that Narada Muni is giving. Can someone read the translation, please?
The living entity, while dreaming, gives up the actual living body. Through the activities of his mind and intelligence, he acts in another body, either as a god or as a dog. After giving up this gross body, the living entity enters either an animal body or a demigod's body on this planet or on another planet. He thus enjoys the results of the action of his past life. Hare Krishna.
Thank you. So, when the living entity goes to sleep, it goes somewhere else. He engages in many adventures, sometimes some miserable, others terrifying, and some pleasurable. His gross body is lying there on the bed. That we are different from the gross body and more intimately connected with the subtle body is what Narada Muni wants to explain to King Prajinabarisat. But we heard about the gross body and how it traps us, and how it ultimately causes misery. But now we are going to hear about the subtle body. We will start reading the Srila Prabhupada's purport, like 7 lines down here. The conclusion is that the subtle body, mind, intelligence and ego creates an atmosphere with desires and ambitions that the living entity enjoys in the subtle body. So, an atmosphere with desires and ambitions. How can one describe the subtle material energy that pervades the body? Srila Prabhupada writes here, it creates an atmosphere, a mood almost. To get a certain gross body, one needs a particular mood in a subtle body to get a certain gross body. So then further, so actually the living entity is in the subtle body, even though the gross body apparently changes, and even though the he, he, he inhabits the gross body on various planets. So that is there, but actually the living entity is situated in the subtle body. So all the activities performed by a living entity in the subtle body are called illusory and not permanent. So this section is going to attack our identification with the subtle body. We have become terrified of hearing about identifying with the gross body because this identification brings about a tremendous type of suffering for the conditioned living entity. And finally, the gross body is being turned into dust or stool or ashes, as Srila Prabhupada explains. So this is the fate of the gross body, but in a sense the identification with the subtle body is more dangerous to identify with your mind. I continue reading the purport. Liberation means getting out of the clutches of the subtle body. Liberation, so it's getting out of the clutches of the subtle body. Liberation from the gross body simply involves the transmigration of the soul from one gross body to another. So in that sense, it is easy. If you want to get liberation from the body, you need to wait 20, 30, 50 years. But we are still trapped by the subtle body. That's the problem. And this is where the trouble really lies. Intelligent minds and false ego together, they are known as the chitta. Then we have here, when the mind is educated in Krishna consciousness or higher consciousness in the modes of goodness, one is transferred either to the upper heavenly planets or to the spiritual world, the Vaikuntha planets. So which do you want to go? In the heavenly planets are really nice. So what is the heavenly planets? Somaras, the sweetest music, no anxiety practically in one's life. And the most beautiful apsaras, when people are speaking of heaven, that is what they want. But if one places one's consciousness so subtly in the mode of goodness, one will be drawn to a body on that level. This is material piety and it results, but there is one problem there. But there is no Krishna. Chitraketu in 1728 Narayana prasa venakotachana bibyati svaraparha svarha pavarha narakesh aptulyakti darshana. The devotees solely engage in the devotional service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Narayan. They never fear any condition of life. For them, the heavenly plans, liberation and hellish plans are all the same. For such devotees are interested only in the service of the Lord. So for one who has a relationship with Krishna, going to Svarga and hell, it's the same. When one is a devotee, then one is not in the material universe, and one sees only happiness wherever he is. One has to change his consciousness. Consciousness by cultivating knowledge received from Vedic instructions from the Supreme Personality of Godhead through the disciplic succession. So if we train the subtle body in this life, by always thinking of Krishna, about Krishna, we will be transferred to Krishna Loka after leaving the gross body. So as Kapila Muni has described, we must dissolve the subtle body, and therefore only bhakti removes the most subtle covering on the material level, the false ego. Based on the false ego, the living entity builds the subtle body, which is meant for enjoyment. False ego places ourselves in the center of material existence. Then, based on the subtle body, the gross body is generated. Bhakti or Krishna consciousness goes to the heart of false ego and changes it. It must change it to be effective. It changes the self-conception. Ego means self-conception. It changes the material self-conception that I'm the center of existence. Ishvaram Ambhohi. That is the material consciousness. Ishvaram, I'm the controller. Ambhohi, I'm the enjoyer. But it changes one's consciousness to Jivera Swarupa Hoy Nitya Nityera Krishna Das. My form, my position is I'm an eternal servant of Krishna. So this is the depth that Krishna consciousness must reach. When you are on that depth, then you live on the transcendental platform. So this is confirmed by the Supreme Personality of Godhead, that Janmakamasmevyam evan yo vetitatvatha Jaktvadhyam punarjanma naitama metasarana. One who knows the transcendental nature of my appearance and activities does not, upon leaving the body, take birth again in this material world, but attains my eternal abode, or Arjuna. So, thus the change of the gross body is not very important, but the change of the subtle body is important. So, the Krishna conscious movement is educating people to enlighten the subtle body. So the darkness of the material world is that we have so many misidentifications. The light of the subtle body is the proper identification. That's the soul is the light of the subtle body. So the perfect example in this regard is Ambarish Maharaj, who always engaged his mind in the service of the lotus feet of the Lord. So, Savaimana Krishna Padaravinaya, similarly, in this life we should always fix our mind on the lotus feet of the Lord, who is present as the Arsha Vihara, the incarnation of the deity in the temple. We should always engage in his worship. So just fixing the mind, but also actually serve. As Krishna tells Arjuna, Mama Nushmara Yudhyacha. First remember me, and then based on the devotional thinking, you serve. And this is actually seva. So we should always engage in his worship. If we engage our speech in describing the activities of the Lord and our ears in hearing about his pastimes, and if we follow the regulative principles to keep the mind intact, to the mind intact for advancing in Krishna consciousness, we shall certainly be elevated to the spiritual platform. So that is why we follow rules and regulations. So What does Srila Prabhupada mean by keeping the mind intact? So he explained that further. Then at the time of death, the mind, intelligence, and ego will no longer be materially contaminated. The living entity is present, and the mind, intelligence are also present. When the mind, intelligence, and ego are purified, all the active senses of the living entity become spiritual. Thus, the living entity attains Satchitananda form. The Supreme Lord is always in his Satchitananda form, but the living entity, although part and parcel of the Lord, becomes contaminated when he desires to come to the material world for material enjoyment. The prescription of returning home is given by Lord Krishna in Bhagavad Gita. Man manabhav madbhakto machi imam namaskar mama vaishasasat mama vaishasayukta vyamatmanamat paraina. Always think of me and become my devotee, worship me and offer your homage unto me, being completely absorbed to me. Surely you will come to me. So if one follows the rules and regulations, the mind becomes healthy and therefore able to think about Krishna, which is the purpose of it. And if the mind doesn't follow the rules and regulations, then there is so much passion and so much ignorance that will infect the mind. Then there is no question of always thinking about Krishna. So to keep the mind healthy, then the mind is intact for practicing Krishna consciousness. And if we do this, then we will be elevated to the spiritual platform. Then right at the end of the purport, Srila Prabhupada writes, the last sentence, the prescription for returning home back to Godhead is given by the Lord himself. Manmana bhavmat bhaktu. So this is Krishna consciousness, to fill our subtle body only with thoughts of Krishna and Krishna's service. This is the goal, the purpose, and the rest of the verses will explain details on this. So I read text 62. It's on the screen.
The living entity labors under the bodily conception of I am this, I am that. My duty is this, and therefore I shall do it. These are all mental impressions, and all these activities are temporary. Nonetheless, by the grace of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the living entity gets a chance to execute all his mental concoctions. Thus, he gets their body. Hare Krishna.
Yeah, so he acts based on the conception of his self. I'm the kind of person who deserves this. I'm the kind of person who is powerful. Whatever conception we have will carry us to our next destination or death. We want to develop a self-conception in relation to our service to Krishna. This is the cultivation of Krishna consciousness. If we are pure and full of love for Krishna, that conception goes a spiritual body. But if we have a doggish mentality or a tiger-like mentality or a worm-like mentality, these will determine our next bodies. What kind of mentality is so important? The super soul will bring us to our next body accordingly. Text 63, someone can read the translation.
One can understand the mental or conscious position of a living entity by the activities of two kinds of senses, the knowledge-acquiring senses and the executive senses. Similarly, by the mental condition or consciousness of a person, one can understand his position in the previous life.
So by the activities of a person, one can understand his mind. The subtle can be understood by studying the gross. By studying the external physical activities, one can understand one's mind. What activities in the past has given this person that kind of mind? Learned transcendentalists can understand things in this way. 64.
Hare Krishna.
Yeah.
Sometimes we suddenly experience something that was never experienced in the past by sight or by hearing. Sometimes we see such things suddenly in dreams.
So sometimes we dream about things which we never have experienced in this life. This is because the mind is carrying experiences from past life. Many times dreams contain compositive experiences from previous lives. The mind stores all these thoughts, and therefore it should be so careful that we allow to come, what we allow to come into the mind. Careful about what we allow to come into the mind. Because we have to experience these things in this life and maybe in our next life. We may get some impression that we see something, and we should be very careful on the material level. Also on the spiritual level, if we get deep desires on the spiritual level, even if they are small and seed-like, they will ultimately come to their fruition and brings us the results. Therefore the conclusion is to as much as possible saturate our consciousness with Krishna consciousness as much as we are possible able. Especially, we should avoid placing material desires in the heart, because these will lead us to future bodies. This is what Sanat Kumar has explained. We want to become detached from the body concept of life and develop an attachment to Krishna. How to do that? That is the process of Krishna consciousness. There is the cleansing part and the cultivation part, two parts. There is the chanting, the association, the deities, the hearing of the Bhagavatam, and for the service. Text 65, someone can read.
Therefore, my dear king, the living entity who has a subtle mental covering develops all kinds of thoughts and images because of his previous body. Take this from me as certain. There is no possibility of concocting anything mentally without having perceived it in the previous body.
Yeah, that's important. That we develop all kinds of thoughts and images because of our previous bodies. That Mozart, when he was 5 to 7 years old, he composed his first symphony. Incredible. Where does this come from? Question mark. Pujan Prabhu told Mukunda Das told Srila Prabhupada that he wanted to go to India to learn to play the sitar. This was in the early days of the 26th 2nd Avenue in New York. So Srila Prabhupada's reply was, learning to play the sitar, that takes many lives. So where does this come from? These desires, the things one learns, and the tendencies, where do they come from? Attraction, repulsions, and fears are carried from one previous life to the next. Because we developed in a previous life, we have to fulfill in this life. The cultivation of Krishna consciousness takes place in the subtle body. So we will read a part of the purport that Krishna Bharamukahana Bhoga Vanchakare Nitanasta Mayatare Chapatiyatare from the Prema Vivakta. Actually, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna, is the supreme enjoyer. When a living entity wants to imitate him, He is given a chance to satisfy his false desire to lord it over material nature. That is the beginning of his downfall. As long as he is within the material atmosphere, he has a subtle vehicle in the form of the mind, which is the stockpile of all kinds of material desires. Such desires become manifest in different bodily forms. So Srila Prabhupada, Srila Narada Muni requests the king to accept this fact from him. Because Narada Muni is the authority. So the mind is actually stores our karma. This knowledge is so important for our progress in spiritual life. Desires are stored and they will dictate our future. The mind is the source of different kinds of bodies, including a spiritual body. Bhagavad Gita 6.6 says, Bandur atmatmanastasya yanatma Bandur atmatmanastasya yanatma evatmana chitaha. So when the mind is fixed on Krishna, the mind becomes the dearest friend of him. He has an attraction for Krishna and he is cultivating that attraction because the mind only business is attraction and repulsion. In some way or other, that point of attraction to Krishna is cultivated, then the mind becomes his greatest friend. And if attraction for Maya is cultivated, then the mind is cultivating something that is going to bring him so much suffering. The conclusion is that we should engage always in devotional service. These are the instructions that are required to purify us and guide us so that we can attain the highest spiritual position. These are the places These are the places here. We are receiving so many instructions on how to deal with the mind. Places in the Srimad Bhagavatam. That always fix the mind on Krishna. Always engage in Krishna's service. And remember the purport in Prithu Maharaj's pastime, where the mind is compared to a river. The way to overcome the flowing rivers of desires is to overflow it with an ocean of desires of Krishna consciousness. The giving up of material desires on the body level can only truly be done by param dristvani vartate, the overflooding with an ocean of Krishna conscious desires, spiritual desires. The mind indicates the past and future desires. Text 66, someone can read, translation.
Hare Krishna.
Thank you.
O King, all good fortune unto you. The mind is the cause of the living entities attaining a certain type of body in accordance with his association with material nature. According to one's mental composition, one can understand what the living entity was in his past life, as well as what kind of body he will have in the future. Thus the mind indicates the past and future bodies.
So if you know one's mind, you even don't need an astrologer to know someone's past and future births. The mind indicates one's previous birth and one's future birth. What we try to do is to minimize the mind's material desires, thus simply living in high thinking, Krishna consciousness, thinking full of loving desires for the service of Krishna. 67, someone can read.
Sometimes in a dream we see something never experienced or heard in this life, but all these incidents have been experienced at different times, in different places, and in different conditions.
Mm-hmm. Right. And also next verse.
Yes. The mind of the living entity continues to exist in various gross bodies, and according to one's desires for sense gratification, the mind records different thoughts. In the mind, these appear together in different combinations. Therefore, these images sometimes appear as things never seen or never heard before.
So the mind can be compared to soft clay. Whatever impressions one places in that clay has its effects in past lives and will have its effect in future life. So 1/3 down in the purport of this text, we have here from here. Can someone read this part of the purport? The transmigration of the soul.
The transmigration of the soul is caused by the subtle body, which is the storehouse of all kinds of material desires. Unless one is fully absorbed in Krishna consciousness, material desires will come and go. This is the nature of the mind, thinking, feeling, and willing. As long as the mind is not engaged in meditation on the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead Krishna, the mind will desire so many material enjoyments. Sensual images are recorded in the minds in chronological order, and they become manifest one after another. Therefore, the living entity has to accept one body after another. The mind plans material enjoyments, and the gross body serves as the instrument to realize such desires and plans. The mind is the platform onto which all desires come and go. Srila Narottam Das Thakur therefore sings, Guru Mukha Padma Vakya Chitete Goriya Akya Arana Goriho Mane Asha. Narottam Das Thakur advises everyone to stick to the principle of carrying out the orders of the spiritual master. One should not desire anything else. If the regulative principles ordered by the spiritual masters are followed rigidly, the mind will gradually be trained to desire nothing but the service of Krishna. Such training is the perfection of life.
So the basic principle is training the mind to desiring nothing but the service of Krishna. How to engage the mind in Krishna's service? Then the egoistic desires coming from the false ego are minimized and finally become void. To help to attain this aim, the spiritual master gives common instructions and to individuals tailored instructions. For what purpose? To help the devotee to become absorbed in spiritual desires. Otherwise, the river of material desires become too strong and they will dictate and force one to take another birth and another one. We all need something to become extremely enthusiastic about in Krishna consciousness. Otherwise, we will not be able to remain absorbed. Text 69. Can someone read?
Krishna consciousness means constantly associating with the Supreme Personality of Godhead in such a mental state that the devotee can observe the cosmic manifestation exactly as the Supreme Personality of Godhead does. Such observation is not always possible, but it becomes manifest exactly like the dark planet known as Rahu, which is observed in the presence of full moon.
Can you read only the first paragraph? I highlighted it on the screen.
Yes. It has been explained in the previous verse that all desires on the platform become visible one after another. Sometimes, however, by the supreme will of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the whole stockpile can be visible all at one time. In Brahma Samhita 5.54, it is said, Karmani nirdahati kintu cha bhakti bhajam. When a person is fully absorbed in Krishna consciousness, his stockpile of material desires is minimized. Indeed, the desires no longer fructify in the form of gross bodies. Indeed, the stockpile of desires becomes visible on the mental platform by the grace of the Supreme Personality of Godhead.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maharaj.
Then, further in this purport, it is said that then when one is fully absorbed in Krishna consciousness, in one stroke he is freed from past and future mental desires. Then by the grace of the Supreme Lord, everything becomes simultaneously manifest within the mind. In this regard, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur cites the example of Mother Yasoda's seeing the whole manifestation within the mouth of Lord Krishna. Similarly, by the grace of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, a Krishna conscious person can see all his dormant desires at one time and finish all his future transmigrations. This facility is especially given to the devotee who makes his path clear for returning back to Godhead. Now text 70. Can someone read the translation? Text 70.
Hare Krishna.
As long as there exists the subtle material body composed of intelligence, mind, senses, sense objects, and the reactions of the material qualities, the consciousness of false identification and its relative objective, the gross body, exists as well.
So as long as the subtle body exists which carries these material desires, the gross material body will also exist. Because the gross body is based on the subtle body. As long as we have these material desires, the gross body will exist. Now, in text 71 to 73, some examples are given how the identification of the gross body and the subtle body are the same. We identify the soul influenced by the mind, who wants to enjoy the gross body, the object of sense gratifications. These four together becomes us, practically speaking. Full identification with these. These examples are meant to break our full identification with the subtle and the gross body. We will first read the text and then speak about them. So we have 71. Someone can read the translation.
When the living entity is in deep sleep, when he faints, when there is some great shock on account of severe loss at the time of death, or when the body temperature is very high, the movement of the life air is arrested. At that time, the living entity loses knowledge of identifying the body with the self.
So at the time of death, the identification with the body stops. Thus, the false identification with the soul and the body are broken. In those circumstances, we do not experience us as the gross body. When one is under anesthetic and operation surgery, yes, when you come out of the anesthesia, then the first is you are identifying with the subtle body. Your consciousness fills the subtle body, and you do not know where you are. So if it can be broken, think about it. If it can be broken, it's not truly us. Important. That's the proof that I experienced myself when I was under surgery. Another example in text 72. Can someone read 72?
When one is a youth, all the 10 senses and the mind are completely visible. However, in the mother's womb or in the body boyhood state, the sense organs and the mind remain covered, just as the full moon is covered by the darkness of the dark moon night.
So at the time when the senses are undeveloped, the living entity's identification with the gross body and other senses and the subtle body is covered. If a beautiful woman is placed in front of a young boy, he becomes agitated, but the same soul is there. But if the beautiful girl is placed before a baby, nothing happens. So the soul, the person, is different from the gross and the subtle body and its objects. The gross body affects the subtle body, and the subtle body affects the gross body. Shall I read it again? The gross body affects the subtle body, and the subtle body affects the gross body. There is no complete harmony between them. They are not the same. What to speak of the person, the soul? Text 73. Can someone read, please?
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
When the living entity dreams, the sense objects are not actually present. However, because one has associated with the sense objects, they become manifest. Similarly, the living entity with undeveloped senses does not cease to exist materially, even though he may not be exactly in contact with the sense objects.
So in dreaming, although the sense objects are not present on the gross level, they are present on the subtle level. And it is the same thing, one becomes agitated. There is no direct correlation between the soul, the subtle body, the gross body, or the sense objects. Whatever I place my concept of self in, and someone touches it, my money, my computer, it gives me pain. These objects are temporarily so-called connected with me, and in different circumstances they don't have a connection with me. We line up the soul with the subtle body as me, identifying I the soul, with the desires of the subtle body, and then they are manifest in a vehicle of gross body which comes in contact with the sense objects, which is the field of activity that the body can enjoy. So we have a sense of self with all those things, and the most subtle of this misidentification is the subtle body. Our conception of identification with all those need to be broken for the purpose of identifying ourselves as Krishna's servants and developing our attachment to Krishna. So the circumstances as having a heavy shock, a high fever, or anesthesia, these temporarily breaks our connection with these things. But we do not want a temporary breaking, but a full breaking of our identification with the bodies, the gross body, the sense objects. So how do we do that? If the soul is not the gross body, the subtle body, and the sense object, what is he? In verse 74, it is described that the soul is just covered by all these things. Can someone read 74?
The five sense objects, the five sense organ knowledge acquiring senses, and the mind are the 16 material expansions. These combine with the living entity and are influenced by the three modes of material nature. Thus, the existence of the conditioned soul is understood.
So 60 material expansions of identification. These combine with the living entity. This is who I am, a conditioned soul. The senses, the sense objects, they all exist in the subtle body. This misidentification exists all in the subtle body. So we will read at the end here of the purport. According to Srimad Vacharya, when consciousness, the living entity in the heart, is agitated by the three modes of nature, then the subtle body consisting of the living entity, then the subtle body of the living entity consisting of mind, sense objects, and the five senses that acquire knowledge, and the five senses for acting in the material world becomes possible. So the three modes of nature affects the consciousness, the chitta, and all of this becomes into action and fully deludes us. The subtlest of these is a false ego, the subtle idea that I'm the enjoyer. This existence is meant for me. You are trying to intervene with me being the center of existence. Then you become my enemy. And when you cooperate, then you are my friend. This is all due to the influence of material nature. This is the core of the soul's illusion. Bhakti will break that sense of identity. The false sense of identity should be dissolved. In other words, in the words of Kapila Muni, we should re-establish our identity as Krishna's servant. How to do that? The last verse, can someone read it on the screen?
By virtue of the process of the subtle body, the living entity develops and gives up gross bodies. This is known as transmigration of the soul. Thus the soul becomes subjected to different types of so-called enjoyment, lamentation, fear, happiness, and unhappiness.
Yes. Because according to Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, King Prajnabarishat was not qualified to take to pure bhakti. He had first to hear this Jnana Mishra Bhakti, so that he can develop a detachment from these things. Because full bhakti is Shravan, Kirtanam, Vishnu, Smaranam, 9 ways of devotional service, direct hearing about Krishna. But this is required and helpful. By hearing this Jnana, we can get direction and gradually dissolve our material existence. And how to break this fully? That can someone read this last purport, starting with the beginning, according to this explanation, and you can read till the end. Yeah.
According to this explanation, one can clearly understand that originally the living entity was as good as the Supreme Personality of Godhead in his pure spiritual existence. However, when the mind becomes polluted by desires for sense gratification in the material world, the living entity drops into the material conditions as explained in this verse. Thus he begins his material existence, which means that he transmigrates from one body to another and becomes more and more entangled in material existence. The process of Krishna consciousness, by which one always thinks of Krishna, is a transcendental process by which one can revert to his original spiritual existence. Devotional service means always thinking of Krishna. Man mana bhava mad bhakto mad yaji mam namaskuru mam evasyasi satyam te pratijane priyosi me. Always think of me and become my devotee. Worship me and offer your homage unto me. Thus you will come to me without fail. I promise you this because you are my very dear friend. One should always engage in the Lord's devotional services recommended in the Archana Marg. One should worship the deity in the temple and constantly offer obeisances to the spiritual master and the deity. These processes are recommended to one who actually wants to be free from material entanglement. Modern psychologists can study the actions of the mind, thinking, feeling, and willing, but they are unable to go deep into the matter. This is due to their lack of knowledge and to their not being associated with liberated acharyas. As stated in Bhagavad Gita 4.2, Evam parampara praptam imam raja shayo vidu sakalenaha Mahata Yoga Nashta Parantapa. The supreme science was received through the chain of disciplic succession, and the saintly kings understood it in that way. But in the course of time, the succession was broken, and therefore the science as it appears to be lost. Guided by so-called psychologists and philosophers, people in the modern age do not know of the activities of the subtle body, and thus cannot understand what is meant by transmigration of the soul. In these matters, we have to take the authorized statements of Bhagavad Gita 2:13, Dehinosmin yata dehe kaumaram yavanam jara tatha dehantara prapti tiras tatrana muhyati. As the embodied soul continually passes in this body from boyhood, youth to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at death. The self-realized soul is not bewildered by such a change. Unless all human society understands this important verse in Bhagavad Gita, civilization will advance in ignorance, not in knowledge.
So, thank you. Then we will now have a break till it's now 6:32 in India, and we will resume at 6:45. So 30 minutes break, and then we will have a discussion of what we heard, and if there are questions and so on, you think about it, and we meet again in about a bit more than 10 minutes. Thank you.
Recording stopped. Recording in progress.
Hare Krishna. So, now we have heard, yes, we have to become liberated from the subtle body. And that's extremely difficult. Why is it extremely difficult? Because it is in the subtle body that all the desires rest. Our karma rests within that subtle body. But what practical action points can be derived from what we heard? If this is called Jnana Mishra Bhakti, but Jnana is a supporting function. It helps us to understand our situation and how to make plans, how to overcome these material desires. So any comments, questions, please?
Hare Krishna Maharaj.
Hare Krishna.
Maharaj, when we were discussing text 71,
Yeah.
yes, there was a point that when a person is in anesthesia, the connection with the gross body and the subtle body is not there.
Yeah.
So, isn't it the state that actually we are aspiring for as a soul?
Well, that is a state of peace, a state of being situated in the self. It's not spiritual life. Spiritual life begins when we are in contact with Krishna. But when we are under anesthesia, we are disconnected in consciousness, but we are still covered by the subtle and the gross body. It's still there. But we are not. But our consciousness is not in the subtle and the gross body. Consciousness comes from the soul. The consciousness is not in the subtle and the gross body by the anesthesia. It has to be redrawn into the soul. And it's like being deaf. Srila Prabhupada writes, at deaf, it's like anesthesia for 8-9 months. And then you get a new gross body from in the womb of the mother, and the consciousness pervades that subtle and new gross body, and you become conscious of the external world. So that is just what's happening. It's not a state to aspire for, certainly not, because it's a state of inactivity. It's peace. And this is, we can say, a temporary liberation. but one is not really liberated, because one is still connected with that subtle and gross body because of your desires. They are stored in this subtle body. But the point made here is the connection is broken. That means we are not the subtle and the gross body, if the connection can be broken, even temporarily. Does that clarify?
Yeah, thank you, Maharaj. Thank you.
Yeah, it's not easy to understand in our conditioned state, for sure.
Can I say something, Maharaj?
Yes, sure. That's why we are there.
Maharaj, when we anesthetize the patient for operation, that is a temporary disconnection between the subtle body and the gross body, and that is due to the effects of drug, and it is controlled.
Yeah.
Even one doctor can control how long he will be separated from each other. And when desires operation is completing, it is in doctor's hand, they bring together and bring consciousness back.
Yeah. That about 2 years ago, I was under full anesthesia and I underwent an operation.
Yes.
And I was on the operation table, and anesthetist, well, that was done in Brussels, and I was on the operation table, and she said to me, I'm from India, and she was looking at my papers and said, oh, you are a vegetarian. I'm also vegetarian. But then when the anesthesia was there and they put a mask on my face, I was meditating on Krishna.
Yes.
I was strongly meditating on Krishna. And then I was seeing Krishna.
Yes, Maharaj.
And then suddenly I saw light. Light. Krishna was still there, but was full of light. And the next thing I saw, that I was in the wake-up room. That was my experience.
Yes, Maharaj, I am also an anesthetist, that's why.
Yeah. So that I found very interesting, because I spoke with many others about that. And they said, yes, when they put a mask on my face, I saw everything becoming black. Nothing. But I did not have that experience. But this time of this operation was like taking away from it. Yes. I was meditating on Krishna beyond, I must say, beyond time and place. That means that if we are Krishna conscious and we become in that state, then we have contact with Krishna. And that's the point. If you are not Krishna conscious, then you are only conscious of yourself.
Yes.
The soul. And that's like Brahman realization, but it's not blissful, because we are not still covered by these subtle and these gross bodies. But that was an interesting experience. Because I had other experience during that moment, which I don't want to share, but it has convinced me that yes, if you are Krishna conscious, fully Krishna conscious, you don't lose your consciousness, even in that situation. But you lose your consciousness to the subtle and the gross body. But there is no Krishna consciousness, then the consciousness is just peace, that's all. And after the operation I felt quite, very peaceful, I must say. That it's interesting, someone says you, yes, you undergo an operation, you think suffering and so on, but for me it was a blissful experience. That's interesting, and it's still a contradiction I can't solve. But this was my personal experience, that it means if you are Krishna conscious, fully Krishna conscious, then these coverings are not there anymore. You find Krishna in your heart, you find the spiritual world in your heart. And the heart means in the soul. Krishna says, I'm the soul of the soul in the Bhagavatam, also in a purport of Bhagavad Gita. And that's also something which is very difficult for us to understand, the soul of the soul. Because Krishna says the soul cannot be cut to pieces and so on. But the super soul is not under material laws. That we have an intimate connection with Krishna. Anyway, thank you for sharing that, Mother Abhirupa. Hare Krishna. Anything else?
No.
Okay. Good. Yes, Mother Ambika.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
So I wanted to, thank you. I wanted to ask about animals, different animal species, because as if I have understood correctly, they are also on different levels of the cycle of birth and death, like coming upwards always from lower species to, more intelligent species. So how about those intelligent species, like, for example, horses and dogs maybe can also understand something a little like human beings, but not that much maybe. But how about those souls? They are obviously more covered with karma and more covered with the subtle body. But do they have the opportunity to become fully purified if they are in such a spiritual environment? Mm-hmm. Or what is the correct understanding?
Yeah, I'm thinking of different examples here from the scriptures. It was, what's his name? Sevananda Sena, or who organized the travel from Bengal to Shivananda Seva. He organized always the travel of the devotees from Bengal to see Vihe, Lord Chaitanya in Jagannath Puri. And 1 year a dog was going with him. And the dog, they walked with them, heard the chanting of Hare Krishna, and was taking prasad with them, and he paid even the tax for the dog. That I got that also. I did 3 times a whole month a parikram in Vrindavan. And at one time there was a dog, and he came always with us and walked with the devotees. and other dogs were barking at him, but he took shelter of the devotees, and then he was also resting when we were resting. The devotees gave him prasad, and that. But this dog of Shivananda Sena, when he finally came to Jagannath Puri, he went ahead, and then when the devotees from Bengal arrived, they saw Lord Chaitanya was throwing prasad, Jagannath prasad to him, to the dog, and dog was eating. And that night the dog left his body, and they saw that a 4-round form came up from it and went to Vaikuntha. So yeah, that is interesting. This may be an exceptional case, but we have also Bharat. When he became attracted to a deer, he got the body of a deer, but still he retained, by spiritual consciousness, he retained his memory, and in the body of a deer he was listening to sages in the ashram, to Bhagavatam and so on. And then in his next life he became Jat Bharat. Normally animals, they go very gradually up, like and you have 4 species who lead to the human form of life. The horse is there, the cow, the monkey, and there is a 4th one that I forgot. But yes, it's a gradual process. If you become a cow, you have 100 cow lives, and then you get the chance of a human body. That means that gradually consciousness has the tendency naturally to go up. Gradually. When you come in this lower species, it goes up. But then when you come to that's natural for the consciousness, it wants to go up. But then you come to the human form of life. And that's a gateway. You can go back to the animal life, or you can back to the heavenly life, or to the spiritual world. The human form of life gives us the chance to expand our consciousness unlimitedly. That's the advantage of the human form of life. And that's not there in the animal life. They may be intellectually on a certain level, like horses, with that story of a horse who could count, and who could, because his teacher was by science, he was teaching him on signs on the world and colors. He was teaching him how to count, and they brought the horse before students, and the students asked, 2 plus 3, and they asked the horse 2 plus 3, and the horse with his nose first touched the sign of 2, and then touched 3, and then 5. So he could count. Very nice, that. But that's material intelligence. To develop spiritual intelligence, that's by the spiritual awareness. That's by the mercy of Krishna only. And Krishna, as Lord Chaitanya, gave mercy to trees, to in the Jharkhand forest, and and to certain animals. He can do that, but normally, according to the laws of nature, it goes gradual. But you never know, by the mercy of a pure devotee, what can happen. Does that help, Mother Ambika? It's a very nice point you make.
Yes, thank you very much.
Hare Krishna. Good. Very good. Then there are no further questions. I wish you tomorrow a nice Gaupunim celebration, and we will meet again this week on Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday. Same time. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna, Jai Prabhupada.
Recording stopped.